Hi, I'm Ben Osterhouse. I'm a composer, cellist, and sample library developer. And in this video, I'll be giving you an in-depth walkthrough of a sample library I created called Ripple Cello. Before we look at the library, I want to tell you about the playing style that inspired it. On string instruments, there's a kind of life and energy you can put into the sound as you travel between two notes, especially if you slur them, putting them into one bow stroke. You can lean into the first note and then let the second note fold into the release of the first note so that they just sound like one cohesive gesture. If you just recorded loud things and soft things, and then maybe stitch them together somehow in Contact, it wouldn't have the same kind of nuance. So let's say we pick a tempo, 110 BPM, and play in this style, swelling over a couple of measures. You have to play around with that a bit to find the right swell and the right tone and get everything to speak nicely, but the swell is fun to play because you can do some interesting things as you get louder and softer. For instance, at the soft parts, I could go like this, and like that second note was hardly even there. It was basically a ghost note. I could also use however much bow I want because it's only 2 notes per bow. So if I wanted to get fancy and change bow positioning like crazy while I was recording a library, I could do that and, just figure out how to make it sound convincing. So let's talk about how Ripple Cello takes this playing style and maps it to a keyboard. To trigger samples, you play overlapping notes like this. This is an individually recorded sample of a minor third going upwards. Right now I have directions set to as played, so if I'd gone like this, it would play a downwards minor third sample. Samples are recorded up to a perfect fourth, so if I play a perfect fifth, nothing happens. As soon as you bridge the gap though, you could get 2 samples moving inwards. And the opposite if you started in the center and went outward. The pedal plays an important role in controlling how samples trigger. Say I went like this. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I couldn't let go of notes in between. There's also a notable difference between going like this, say, and if I had had to play all of those notes, holding them down. Besides that, the pedal is useful for just connecting things more, the same way it's useful on a regular piano. As you can see, there are 3 articulations in this library, and so far we've only been listening to the quarters. So here are the eighths. And here are the 16ths. You may be wondering why it's 16th snap instead of just 16ths, I found that continuous 16th notes in this style at 110 BPM was just a bit chaotic. I wasn't able to add the nuance and shaping that I wanted. I still wanted to have an articulation with the energy and snappiness of 16ths though. So I used this dotted rhythm, which you can actually see in the example notation if you click here. The expression and reverb knobs can provide a nice starting point for shaping the sound, but they're not too extensive. Just 3 reverbs here. It's great fun to play big chords into ripple cello and see what comes out of it, but when it comes to actually using it, there are some ways of programming the MIDI that can make a big difference. To make sure you get the most out of the library, I've built in a MIDI clip browser. Because the interface doesn't include many knobs, everything can be set using key switches. So on top of providing examples, these MIDI clips essentially serve as presets. Next, I'm going to go over each of the options. The first option, speed, adjusts how samples will be time stretched to fit your project tempo. Let's listen to this set of chords at the recorded tempo. Now a little slower. And now even slower. So you can hear at 60 things start to sound a bit woozy. This is where the speed options might be useful because you could set the speed to double and it would sound like this. Vice versa if your project uses a very quick BPM. There are 2 triplet options. One of them stretches the samples so that they're quarter triplets, and the other stretches them so they become eighth triplets. And this just gives you a few more options rhythmically. The 3 direction modes control how upward and downward moving samples get triggered. With direction set to as played, the direction of ripples is determined by the order you play notes in. It will try to play a ripple going from the last note you played to the most recent one. If the recent note is out of range of the last note, like it's greater than a perfect fourth, and you happen to still be holding another note which is in range of the current note, it'll use that note to make the ripple. So if I play a note up here, and a note down here, and then another one that's way far away from this recent note, but still happens to be pretty close to this one, I had to really think this through with the scripting, but you shouldn't have to be this analytical when you're playing the library. That was cool. The down and up options give more control, and they don't have as much clever logic compared to the as played option. No matter what order you play notes in, ripples will always go either up or down. The sync options are kind of like input quantization and also kind of like legato. It's a bit of a mix. When you hear and see them in action, it might not be apparent what they do, so I'm going to use Reaper to show what happens inside of Contact. Let's take this sample. This is an A going to B. And this would be triggered if I had gone like this. Now, let's say that A to B is playing, and I play another note at some point, C sharp to D. Now, C sharp to D would be triggered. We'll name it as well, C sharp to D, and it would start right like so. So it'd be out of sync. And this is what would happen if sync was set to off. Now let's say sync was set to swells. This added sample would be in sync with the first sample I triggered, but we would cut into it like so. This could be useful if you want to create a chord change right at the crest of the swell. Next, I'm going to show you the sync options for ripple and pitch. Let's say we split these samples into two note pairs. When I added this second sample, it would stay snapped to the pairs of notes of the first sample, but it would cut into this first pair right here and fade like so. It's nice to have those parallel thirds being in time with each other, but as you can see, the swells now get out of sync, and this can lead to some nice evolving textures. Here's an example of that using the black keys. Sync to pitches is similar to the ripples option. The difference is that instead of cutting it into these two note pairs, I'm going to cut it at every pitch change. Now when I triggered a second sample, it would snap like this, and it would cut into the first pitch this far and fade, resulting in this. So now as the first sample is going up, the second sample is going down. With vel to start enabled, velocity no longer controls volume. Instead, it controls where samples start playing from. If I played this pair of notes at full velocity, then it would start from this loudest part, and then as I triggered it at softer and softer velocities, it would start further back. It can sound unnatural cutting into the samples like this, but this vel to start option does give you a lot of control. When developing sample libraries, I haven't done much with release samples until now with Ripple Cello. When I was recording the release samples, originally I tried to record, piano, mezzo forte, but it didn't fit quite right, and I realized what I really needed to do was to just play the original samples and then see what kind of articulation I would want to use if I wanted to bring things to a nice close. I found a particular way of triggering the release samples, and I'm going to continue using Reaper to show how that works. Once you turn on release samples, there are 4 options, or you can choose the auto option, which will select a release sample depending on where in the swell you let go. So let's say I played a note and then I stopped it here. The sample would continue playing until here with no fade out, just a small one maybe. And then I've made the script probably choose the second release sample if we're in auto mode. And you can hear they fit together pretty seamlessly. Most of the time you'll want to use the auto option if you want things to end gently no matter what. It's nice to be able to just set it to release sample number 1 or 2. When release samples are turned off, fade out depends on where in the sample you let go. So let's say I let go there. Then the sample would stop playing by this time and it would fade out starting from here. Because if you were to have the fade out happen like this maybe, then that next note gets faded out right as it's starting, and it sounds a bit unnatural. On either side of the playable range, there are red key switches which manually trigger release samples. Let's say you have release samples turned off, but you still do want a release at the end. You could simply press one of those key switches and it'll bring all the ripples to a nice close. Note that the key switches trigger different release samples depending on how hard you play them. If I were to go like this and then play loud, we get the loudest release sample, vice versa. You may have noticed this clock here. If I set the lateness to 100 milliseconds, then I could go into the track settings and set a negative playback offset. All DAWs have a feature like this. Take a look at the output if I record this to another track. The sound actually starts before the click. It's this little bit of noise as the bow is warming up the string. I didn't want to chop that off, but if I left it in, then everything would be late. So you have the option to leave that noise in, and then you can just set a negative track delay. Here's what it sounds like without. It's right on time. And it doesn't sound too clipped, but it could sound just a little bit better if it had that little bit of noise. Well, that covers everything about how Ripple Cello works. Like many other Osterhouse sounds libraries, these aren't your standard string articulations. They're a specific playing style which is mapped to the keyboard in a way that's unique and also intuitive. The hope is that this particular style of playing inspires you to explore different ways of using strings in your music, either as you're using sample libraries or working with players. Thanks for watching.